Okay, hello and welcome to this MEI Zoom event, Oil, Arms, Drones, and Regional Tensions, the second Berlin Conference on Libya and crafting a new interim government. So good afternoon to those joining us in the States, and good evening to those tuning in from Europe and MENA. As ever, the last few weeks in the sphere of international diplomacy about Libya have been filled with the twists and turns that tend to characterize the Libya file on the international stage. A constant contest among multiple actors to seek to dominate the Libya file and to set the terms under which mediation, economic reforms, or any solution or ceasefire or election or East-West institutional unification process will be determined. Today's a very good day to be talking about these matters, as over the last few hours, the United Nations and Germany began co-hosting a virtual ministerial level meeting of the 16 countries and international organizations that took place in the Berlin conference of January 2020. And today's meeting has been dubbed by some the second Berlin conference. But from my perspective, it's just a UNGA margins meeting ministerial. It's an attempt to build on the momentum that's been perceived to exist in the international sphere vis-a-vis Libya peace and mediation. And this is being consciously framed as a follow-up to the January Berlin conference, so as to remind various countries of the commitments they've undertaken, which they're not adhering to, such as the arms embargo. And why do we need to even have this meeting? That's to reassert the primacy of the UN track, because over these last days, we've seen such a range of competitor tracks and the attempt by Russia and Turkey to scoop the mediation process. Therefore, to understand the import or lack thereof of today's meeting and all the other rival talks and tracks that have been taking place in Morocco, in Egypt, and those scheduled for Switzerland, but being contested by Tunisia, today's panel will try to unpack the backdrop to these events and their possible significance moving forward. With the war for Tripoli being won in the late spring of this year by GNA-aligned defenders, receiving ever-increasing Turkish military assistance, and a new mutually hurting stalemate taking hold around Jufra and Sirte over the course of the summer, Libya's wars of post-Gaddafi succession are not being fought in a hot, kinetic way over the last few months. Rather, they've shifted to cyberspace and the negotiating table. Today's meetings and the prior ones that I mentioned in Morocco and Egypt are formally about issues to which my mind are unsolvable at this stage or this phase of the conflict. So Morocco and those talks are about bringing together the HOR and the Higher State Council to divvy up the new positions for the semi-sovereign institutions. And Egypt and other meetings are about trying to have army reunification. I don't see how those things can be solved at this moment. And all these processes seem unachievable without really having the diplomatic tools that the international community has being used in one voice and in one process. So this is the context that we're facing today. And to flesh this out, each of our panelists, who are all retired or current diplomats or government officials, will speak about these events from a different lens with which to view this contest over the Libya file. We'll hear first from a military angle, and we're fortunate to have Wolfgang Pusztai, who was the Austrian attaché in Tripoli, and then on a regional perspective of how these actions vis-a-vis the Libya file are connected to larger developments in the Eastern Mediterranean and MENA, we'll turn to Deborah Jones, the former US ambassador to Libya. And lastly, from a diplomatic perspective and possibly a look ahead to 2021, we'll hear from Jonathan Weiner, who is the former American Special Envoy to Libya. Now, I look forward to taking audience questions after our panelists have spoken through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching the panel on the live stream, you can also ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. If you have any questions about technical issues, also please email events@mei.edu. So as I said, after Ambassador Weiner has spoken, we will have 15 to 20 minutes to field your questions, which you can submit at any time as I or the panelists are speaking. Before handing off to this supremely informed panel, I thought to set the stage by giving some of my own background on how it's impossible to understand the flurry of diplomatic competition about the Libya conflict without grasping this context of a Cold War unfolding in the MENA region and Eastern Mediterranean. I think this pits what I call a traditionalist status quo bloc against an Islamist or anti-status quo bloc. The Trump administration has certainly taken sides in this Cold War, making no secret of supporting the traditionalist pro-monarchy, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-status quo bloc, which consists of Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Morocco, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, Oman and Kuwait. And despite that bloc having most of the economic power, it's on the back foot regionally to an ascending group of governments that oppose the status quo, which support political Islam of one stripe or another. And that rival anti-status quo bloc is led by Turkey, Iran, Qatar, but also contains the Palestinians and the Lebanese Shia. Over the past 9 years, Libya has served as the economically most important battleground between these region's two blocs. And leaders of the traditionalist bloc are supported by Russia, and they tend to support General Khalifa Haftar and other Eastern potentates in the context of the Libya conflict. Whereas local communities and militias opposed to Haftar support the UN-backed government of national accord, which receives tangible diplomatic assistance from Italy, Germany, the UK, occasionally the US, and the UN. However, those countries, other than Turkey, refused to offer the requisite military assistance when Tripoli was under attack in 2019. So from early 2020 onward, the Turkish government stepped in on behalf of this insurgent regional bloc, funneling drones and Syrian mercenaries to Libya's shores to protect Tripoli and defeat Haftar. Both sides have no doubt committed atrocities, and the Turks have pushed for a maritime exclusive zone, which clearly violates international law and Greek, Cypriot, and Egyptian maritime rights in an attempt to turn Turkey into an Eastern Med's gas and exploration power and regional, dominant player. This position of Turkey seeking an economic peace dividend from winning the Libya war was reiterated again yesterday with a meeting between Erdogan and Sarraj in Istanbul. Despite Turkey's aggressive regional posture and controversial military and maritime actions, it is the Russian and Emirati maximalism that has been keeping Haftar in place and making it more difficult to reach a compromise to end Libya's civil war. So this begs the question, what of the role of the US? During a brief period of the late spring and early summer months of this year, the American government spearheaded negotiations to lift Libya's oil blockade, which was imposed by Haftar and his tribal allies backed by the UAE and Russia, all of whom claim to be demanding a greater share of oil revenue for the East. And now the US, coordinated with Turkey, tried to cement the GNA's territorial gains, calling out Haftar's forces for human rights violation, and engaged in a shuttle diplomacy between the two main factions. To my analysis, this period of greater US engagement has ended as the US elections have approached and the US was responding to the Israel-UAE peace deal. However, with this backing off of US engagement, we've seen the Russians scoop the oil deal. And this happened 2 weeks ago via the Sochi meeting between Haftar's son Khalid and Ahmed Maitig. This is a classic case of how Russia outflanks rival powers to dominate the Libya file at key moments. Those attempts by Russia and earlier France to resuscitate Haftar's otherwise flagging fortunes, plus the ongoing electricity protests in Tripoli, have left Prime Minister Sarraj in an untenable position, such as his facing calls for his removal and struggles with the very popular Misratan moderate Fatih Bashaga, the interior minister. So he announced his willingness to step aside at the end of the month if a replacement can be created. That is the context of what is at stake in the mediation meeting. So the mediating powers, Egypt, Russia, Turkey, the UN, Morocco, Tunisia, the EU, each have their own mediation track, competing to set the terms of the process, which will select Libya's next interim government, as well as a framework to adjudicate how Libya's oil monies are spent, how its economy is reformed. So my take on this moment is that it's a diplomatic tohu vabohu. That is a war of all against all being fought for dominance over the Libya file as each power wants to see if it can set the list of names for the potentially new office holders as they will be selected. At this point, the outcome of today's Second Berlin Conference, which is really, as I pointed out, just a UN General Assembly margins ministerial, does not look particularly promising. No clear steps have been established towards strengthening the arms embargo that prohibits countries from sending weapons or taking other steps to fuel Libya's conflict, leaving some observers to believe that it's just a matter of time before one side, supported by foreign weapons suppliers, launches another attack, especially if they gain access to some source of funds from oil sales. Without a unified consensual process at the international level and a full and lasting ceasefire, a new political process remains a distant prospect. Therefore, the upshot of today's meeting appears to be that a consensus process to replace the Presidential Council GNA structure and move to a new transitional phase or the unification of Libya's institutions is as far away as it's ever been. That's quite unfortunate. And why might this process be failing? And that's because the Turks and the Russians would be very happy for a UN, Berlin, Morocco, Geneva process to fail, wait in the wings and inject their own Turkey and Russia-led process. On this very happy note, I'd like to turn it over to Wolfgang Pustai, who can tell us about the military aspect of where we're at present. Thank you, Wolfgang.
Thank you very much. I would like to give you a brief overview about the military state of play and its implications and on how things play out going forward. The situation after the end of the Battle of Tripoli is far from stable, as you have indicated already. Actually, all over the country, in the east, in the south, in the west, there are demonstrations, at times violent demonstrations, against the governments. Sarraj has resigned or announced his resignation, and the Eastern Prime Minister Altini has also announced his resignation, against corruption, against the deteriorating living conditions. In the south, local LNA units are fighting against ISIS. Just recently, there was a raid in Sepa where about 10 ISIS members were killed, including the ISIS member in Libya. In Tripoli, unfortunately, we see clashes between rogue militias, between rogue pro-GNA militias, almost every day. Just the day before yesterday, a couple of people were killed, and the day before, there were also some more people killed in clashes in Western Tripoli. Yesterday, it was more about Eastern Tripoli. There are failed attempts to disband militias not allied to the Misrata bloc, led by Minister of the Interior, Fatih Bashaga, and more recently also some attempts by the Minister of Defense, Salah al-Namroush, who hails from Zawiya. Actually, this demonstrates clearly that after the end of the siege of Tripoli, there are fractures within the Operation Volcano coalition. But from a military point of view, maybe more interesting, let's have a look on the situation and on the operational environment in the Sirte theater, because what's going on in Tripoli was already the case for years. It was briefly, let's say, interrupted during the Haftar offensive, and now we see the same situation again. In the Sirte region, we have two major parties facing each other. On the one side, there is the Turkish-supported Operation Volcano of Rage, and on the other side, we have the so-called Libyan National Army. This is about, let me make this clear, this is about the key terrain, the gateway to the oil crescent. So if Sirte or Al-Jufra get captured by Operation Volcano, the LNA would not be able to defend forward of the oil crescent anymore. Maybe even more interesting, Al-Jufra is the airbase used by the Russian MiG-29 and Sukhoi 24 jets. And if this base would be in the hands of Operation Volcano, they would need much more time to get from bases in the east into the theater. Let's have a brief look on the military capabilities. The Libyan National Army is in a defensive position. Let me make it clear, they are currently not capable for any larger offensive operations in Tripolitania, and it is unlikely that they will be able for large offensive operations anytime soon. There is no indication that Russia or Egypt or the Emirates would be willing to boost them in a way that they would be able to advance towards Tripoli again. The Russian support, air force, air defense, construction of defensive sites, and the mobile force for the oil installation is of significance, but more of a defensive purpose. On the other side, Operation Volcano still looks more like a pickup army with limited offensive capabilities against an entrenched enemy, as it's now the case with the Libyan National Army. This brings me to Turkey. Turkey still provides enablers and combat support. combat support ranging from electronic warfare to drones, to air defense capabilities, and maybe most of relevance on the battlefield, precision-guided artillery. But the Turkish military capabilities are overstretched. They are engaged in their own country, in Kurdistan. They are engaged in the Aegean Sea, in the Cyprus area, in Syria, in Iraq, and probably also right now in Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh. This means they have a problem to project all the forces they would need to gain a decisive success in Libya. So the likely intention of Operation Volcano is to advance to the east at the earliest opportunity and to eliminate the Libyan National Army once and for all. They've tried already surprise attacks on Al-Jufra oasis, keep in mind the Russian airbase there, and tried to steer an internal uprising at the Jufra oasis. For the time being, they failed. Turkey will support such an advance to the east at the given moment. And for Turkey, it's crucial to at least prevent a breakaway of the east, as this would have a very negative consequence, in particular for the maritime agreement, as mentioned by Jason before. This brings me to Egypt. Egypt's President Al-Sisi has declared a red line at the Sirte Al-Jufra area. His intentions are to prevent any kind of Islamist-leaning, especially Muslim Brotherhood-led government, or some kind of an ungoverned space on its western border. Egypt considers such a scenario as a deadly threat, and they will give and use any means to prevent this. But as I've said already, they are not willing to support any kind of LNA advance to Tripolitania. So this is more of a defensive intention. The threat by Egypt to intervene and to stop any attack on Sirte and on Al-Jufra, if it materializes, has a good chance for success. Why? This is a relatively easy military task, The logistic lines from Turkey to Misrata and Tripoli are very long. They are passing by the Egyptian territory. They could be easily cut off. Everything what Egypt would need to do is to focus right now, keeping in mind that the Operation Volcano is more of a pickup army, to eliminate Turkish command and control, air defense, drone bases, a few electronic warfare systems, and Turkish artillery. The rest of the Operation Volcano would not be able to conduct a successful offensive operation. Egypt and the Emirates have hundreds of advanced British-French cruise missiles in their stocks, with a range of about 800 miles. It would be an easy task for them to eliminate these targets. Turkey is aware of this. As I've said, Operation Volcano has attempted already, being aware of this situation, 3 times to raid Al-Jufra, because if Al-Jufra is gone and the Egyptians have not intervened, the stakes for Egypt would be much more higher. This would drag Egyptian ground forces into the theater, and this is what Al-Sisi wants to prevent at any means. So right now, we have a stalemate. Turkey wants to change the nature of Operation Volcano forces. What they are doing right now is to train them in combined arms warfare. So to change the nature from a pickup army to a combined warfare army. This will take time. But if they manage to conduct combined arms warfare on their own, they will have offensive capabilities on their own. And this would multiply the targets for Egypt. So this would not be only about a couple of cruise missiles. This would drag probably Egyptian ground forces into the war. And this is what is probably the intention of Turkey in order to ensure that they would not need to deal with the Egyptians on Libyan territory, as Egypt, as I've said already, wants to prevent such a scenario. So what is the conclusion of the situation right now? From my point, it would be critical to ensure the ceasefire by establishing a demilitarized zone, but not a demilitarized zone supervised by any kind of Libyan joint force, but this would need to be supervised by an international force. This could be, for example, a European Union battle group. Let me stress, currently, one of these battle groups is led by Germany, by a German paratrooper brigade. I would rule out that Turkish or Egyptian forces would try to attack German soldiers. I'm pretty sure that Erdogan doesn't even think about this. So the deployment of such a European force to ensure the demilitarized zone could stabilize the ceasefire. On the political level, I would say it would make sense, as it's discussed already right now, and Stephanie Williams is also behind this as far as I understand, to establish a new 3-member presidential council with 1 member from each of the 3 historic provinces. I doubt, as it was recently also mentioned by Fatih Bashaga quite interestingly, that such a government could act independently in Tripoli. maybe it would be really a good idea, as I've written already for the first time in 2014, to move such a government to Sirte or to another location in the oil crescent. From my point of view, to come to the end, the only way forward for stabilizing Libya is to stabilize Libya in its parts, achieving progress with regard to stabilization where the situation allows it, and reward from the international community this progress. And a key foundation for such a progress would be an agreement about the distribution of the oil revenues. If there is such an agreement, and they are working on this right now, and the Americans are firmly behind this, this would take much of the heat out of the tensions, would take much of the heat out of the conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. That was an excellent job of giving the details of the military and technological situation and why the advantage lies with the defenders, and that might lead towards a very propitious situation for mediation and diplomacy, because a stalemate militarily helps things diplomatically. You also commented on the regional aspects of the war, and to hear more about those regional aspects, I'd like to turn now to Ambassador Deborah Jones.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Wolfgang. And I have to say now that by now my head is swimming again with all these details, and I think our audience will clearly understand why this is such a difficult situation, and one that for diplomats and practitioners anyway, we attempted to simplify it in ways that would help Libyans see their own solutions. So I want to make a few, I don't have the kind of tick, tick, tick down the line, but I do want to make a few larger points. One, I do believe that the biggest challenge for Libyans and the reason for all the regional intervention is that space abhors a vacuum. People have interests. I do believe that, and I'll say this up front, I believe our knowledge of Libya was so limited at the time of the intervention and the NATO intervention, which again, I remind people was called for by the Arab League as well. There was a cumulative call for this intervention. I think by people who genuinely lacked a clear understanding, not only of how both fragmented and networked Libya was inside, but also miscalculations of the strengths of the various players in it. I do agree with what has been said here, that this is about resources. It is not ideological. It's not as though you have an Islamist Salafist Libya fighting against a secular Libya by any means. I do think it is more status quo ante versus true revolutionaries who sought for a long time, and I'm talking here about the LIFG and others, to overthrow Gaddafi. But at the end of the day, the irony, of course, is that the thing that does hold Libya together is the oil. It is the oil. As I've often said, oil is the heart, lungs, and arteries of the Libyan state. It's the one thing that runs through all parts of the tripartite of the old view of Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and Fezzan of Libya. It connects the oases to the tribal areas into the city-states. And I believe that it is this battle for these resources based on legacy aspects of the revolution, in part, who different states protected and fought with and supported, whether it was militias in the West or groups that were more Islamist in nature, and how that legacy has carried through. Let me first make a comment. My own government's fecklessness in this has been disappointing from the beginning. I often used to say that the challenge for us in Libya was because it was fluid, transactional, and opportunistic. I must say now that I would add that description to our own government's approach to Libya, and I would add the word pernicious, in fact, because the timing of the call to Haftar and with Haftar, frankly, upended a process that did have at the time some promise and was promised to have some kind of resolution. Turkey has always had It has a historical presence in Libya. It has a lot of business in Libya. And I think if you look at Turkey writ large, without wanting to sound like an apologist, but I think one can argue that Turkey does not get involved in places where it does not see its national security lie. And that includes Syria, that includes right now in Azerbaijan, and that also includes in Libya to some extent. And I would even extend and just quote, again, not by way of explanation, not by way of justification, the words not long ago of the Turkish foreign minister to the effect that Turkey has, when you count all the islands and add it all up, Turkey has the longest coastline in the Eastern Mediterranean and should not be reduced to being a tourist spot while others exploit the energy resources that are in that area. And also, of course, the irony is that when I served in Istanbul, our big effort there was to support gas lines and oil lines through Turkey pipelines that would enable Europe to receive energy from Turkey and not be reliant on the Russians for this energy that they could then use to put a chokehold on Europe. And even as I speak, I know that within the US Congress, there are elements within the Turkish caucus and other energy producing states in the United States who believe that Turkey remains strategically important for that reason as well, that we should be working on energy there to prevent a Russian advance. So there's one aspect of our policy that's at odds or that seems to be out of sync with others. I would say in the case of, and in the case of Qatar, the people they were supporting were again, some Ali Salabi and a number of the so-called Islamists who were supporting the revolution before and who had worked, frankly, quite closely with Abdullah Sanusi and with Saif al-Islam on the rehabilitation of groups like the LIFG, who were in fact, its former members were part and parcel of the political system when I arrived in Tripoli, no matter the opposition of some people to my interactions with them. In the case of the United Arab Emirates, of course, their alliances and their support went for more of the status quo anti-groups. And I think, again, that they, together with some in our own security apparatus, believed and took Mahmoud Jibril, Allah yirhamo, at his word when he said he could control this government and promised that he could put everything in order. And I think that some people truly saw this as some kind of a removal of Gaddafi, the thorn in everyone's side, and a move on to some kind of Dubai in the Mediterranean, that like, Athena out of the head of Zeus, of Metis, that we were going to have another affluent city on the Mediterranean edge. I had at least one senior US official before I went out say to me, after all, Deborah, it can't be that hard. 6 million Libyans, that's the same as an American state or less, and 1.2 million barrels of oil a day. Because we could not come up with the important role that the United States played before was keeping everyone on the same sheet of music. When the United States withdrew as a player politically or even as an enforcer, when there was a realization that this had really become a group of ever-increasing factions and that we had competing interests with the other states that were involved. And as Jonathan knows very well, we were never able to get unified administration positions, much less international positions on sanctions or on means of reprimanding or restraining some of the elements who were contributing to the external interference. Then things just became very difficult indeed. Our position had always been, my position had been, that if you can isolate Libyans long enough, give them a safe place for negotiation, they would in fact be able to come up with some solutions that met Libyan needs. But by this time, and I think we were able to do that to some degree in the Berlin process before, although we had, as Jonathan will recall, there was a large hue and cry from observer states or other states who felt that they at least needed to be there to observe and no doubt to twist a few arms. Because we are seeing what Jason, I think, has accurately described, as a Cold War that in lieu of being about Soviet ideology versus Western capitalism or what have you, this is about groups, and this would include Russia as well as the UAE, who have said they are opposed to, they do not believe that that democracy is an appropriate vehicle for governance in the Muslim world, that it inevitably leads to activities, intolerance, authoritarianism, I mean, all of which I find ironic in its own ways, but never mind that you wouldn't have in a more traditional sense. I think the real issue is about order and obedience as opposed to the messiness, the inherent messiness that comes with democracy and the different strains within a Islamic democracy or whatever you want to call it, as well as genuine concerns about the resources going from Libya to fund, to spread this kind of blight across the region and to create insecurity and unrest. And of course, let me say at the end of the day, as what we know from diplomacy in the past is generally said there are three reasons for conflicts to end. People have either been hurt enough or impoverished enough or exhausted enough that they are prepared to come to the table to negotiate. I don't think we've seen, I think we're closing in on some of those areas right now within Tripoli. I'm not sure it applies to the regional players in the same way. And so they may be tempted to continue to fish in troubled waters. The problem is that we may reach a point that, the only people who suffer in this truly are the Libyan people themselves, because energy is their ability to produce the oil is limited. The cost of oil has gone down so much that the benefit to them is even less. And meanwhile, their cities are destroyed, and they're left depleted and ill and completely without structures. But again, I go back to my main point. The biggest problem is the vacuum within Libya itself, and the inability that they showed from the beginning, by the way, to conduct themselves as an independent political entity. By the time I had arrived in Tripoli in June of 2013, we later discovered Tariq Mitri was already negotiating with the multiple parties in a GNC, a parliament that was completely unable to agree on anything and get anything done because the revolution was unfinished. And I think that has been my point from the beginning, that we inherited an unfinished revolution. It goes on, and it's now everyone's punch drunk, and it goes on, and we don't have a solution yet. But I'll leave it at that and wait for questions later.
Jason, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was just going to thank Ambassador Jones for really giving us a lot of the historical background to the diplomacy we've seen, as well as some of the details that make a solution in Libya so complicated. I feel like we've heard quite a bit about the past and all these complexities. I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan Weiner, the former special envoy to Libya, to talk about how he sees things as they are now and maybe moving forward, ways in which we could move towards solution, hopefully. Thank you.
In the work that Ambassador Jones and I were able to do on Libya, we started with some basic principles which contributed to the success, to the extent it was a success, of the Skhirat process and of the creation of a government of national accord. And those principles included having one negotiating process, not multiple fora. If you have multiple fora, people will select and none of them will take hold. So everything got shoveled back to the UN, which was totally flawed, totally impossible, totally useless, could not work, but was by far the best solution and actually led to a negotiated settlement. Incomplete, but it did work. Second, the patrons need to tell their clients it's time for them to deal. They have to deal. And Skhirat would not have been possible without Qatar and Egypt and the UAE and Russia and China and Italy and France, as well as Algeria, Morocco, and so on, all saying now's the time we need to deal. Third, there have to be benefits to all the major regions. This means all across the coast and some benefits to the interior, because any region that doesn't get benefits inside the deal is going to be outside the deal. Now, if you look at those preconditions, right now we have a multiplicity of negotiating fora, as you laid out, Jason. The patrons are saying one thing in Berlin and a different thing in national capitals. And you see Haftar resurrected again when he is anathema to the people he's attacked. You still do also see some independent action from Aguila, which demonstrates that the Haftar resurrection remains incomplete. So what can change? Well, the US stepped back under the Trump administration, had an inconsistent policy, and often there has been a vacuum. That vacuum is being filled well by Ambassador Norland, but there's only so much he can do as an ambassador without further constant backing from the White House and senior officials in the Department of State, Department of Defense, and elsewhere. So no matter how good you are, you can't do it alone. You really need to be backed. So the US role could potentially change in a Biden administration. So given where things are now, what are the solutions? Well, from my point of view, you have to push the foreigners first, because pushing the Libyans, if the foreigners are lined up against one another, isn't going to work, because they can go back to their patrons and have their patrons allow them to avoid a compromise. One of the reasons the GNA fell apart was the Russians gave billions of dollars worth of dinars to Haftar and the East to build their own independent patronage networks, which sent them the message they didn't have to deal. And this played a huge role in 2016 to allow Aguila to do what he did and not ratify the GNA. So you actually have to have the foreigners on board the process in order to get the Libyans on board. So in order to do that, you have to have countries who aren't on board suffer consequences, and you have to have them gain benefits for getting on board. So I asked myself, how can Turkey win the war, win the conflict through a deal? And how can Egypt win at the same time? And how can the Emirates win at the same time? And how can Russia win at the same time? How can you carve a deal in which the parties on different sides can all win? That may sound contradictory at first, but it actually isn't, because if Libyan oil were actually to be exploited by United Libya and you create national institutions and you don't have a MB government and you have power distributed so that there's some wealth going everywhere and you have money distributed so there's some wealth going everywhere, you begin to have a deal that can be appealing to Libyans and protect core interests of the national powers. I would think Turkey would like to see construction contracts for Turkish firms. I would think Egypt would like to see some of that for Egyptian firms, but also jobs for Egyptian workers. And not only jobs, but jobs with safety, where they're not going to potentially be lined up in orange jumpsuits on a beach and have their heads cut off by terrorists. Their necks throat slit by terrorists. That's a legitimate concern for Egypt. Egyptian border is a legitimate concern. What does Russia want? Russia wants as much influence as it can get. And if Libyans choose to make it uncomfortable for Russia, if Libyans choose to make it uncomfortable for Russia, Russia will have to leave. That is what happened, after all, in Egypt under Sadat. So it is possible. But Libyans are going to, in the end, have to be the ones to push Russia back. That's probably not something the United States is in a really great position to do at this point, having sanctioned Russia on all kinds of things. But you have to look for what are the benefits each country can get for doing a deal, and what are the risks if they don't do a deal. Well, there have to be consequences. If you've got arms, if you buy arms or resupply, or you have to get them maintained, or ammunition bought, or the arms fixed from the United States, and you're using your arms in ways the United States doesn't like, the United States can slow down, slow walk that process, or even stop it. And it can let you know privately before doing it publicly. If you've been violating commitments you profess publicly, you can get embarrassed publicly by the United States criticizing you in public for your engagement and support of lethal force that's killing Libyans. The United States is putting out the message that this foreign country, that foreign country is killing Libyans, killing civilians, women, children, cadets, training to become soldiers. That becomes a disincentive because you're convincing Libyans to turn against you, as well as yourself at risk with the United States, not only the executive branch, but the Congress. So the United States has tools, even apart from sanctions, to be able to discourage countries from behaving in ways that are inconsistent with their own professed public policies and commitments at the UN. And the United States has ways of facilitating, potentially, win-win solutions as well. And so do the Libyans. So I think the solution, which is not one that's going to happen in the month of October 2020, regardless of how long people stay in Berlin, whether they're in person or by Zoom or Teams or Skype, is one in which the United States is deeply engaged, is operating privately at first, but prepared to go public, is providing structures to create win-wins for participants and damage for people who aren't, so they get exhausted and decide they've had enough and want to be part of the solution. And that's the way diplomacy can work. It can't be done by an ambassador alone, or not even by one who is incredibly brilliant and dedicated, no matter who that might be. It has to be done with an all-administration effort. It's still hard. Can it be done? Yeah, it can, because there are benefits to all the Mediterranean from a Libya solution. You can have economic benefits to the entire Mediterranean coastline, all the way around. That's a lot of countries. And last I remember, that includes Turkey, and that includes Egypt. And then you can have benefits for the region beyond that in MENA in Europe. It also includes France and Italy, of course. So that's how I look at it. There's still real opportunity. We just can't expect it necessarily to be taken advantage of in October 2020. Libya may have to participate in the global pause that has been this appalling year of 2020. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those engaging remarks. And I'd like to just point out that those stressing of win-wins and the way in which everyone can benefit from a solution to the economic and military aspects of the Libya conflict is a very important framing. I'll use my prerogative as the moderator to pose the first question. But before I do so, I'd like to remind you all to write questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, or to email the events team at events@mei.edu. So following on Jonathan's cogent remarks, the question I'd like to pose to each of the panelists is, what is one example of a low-hanging fruit of a win-win that you could spot? Wolfgang talked about something interesting, such as peacekeepers in Sirte, potentially from Germany. And I'm folding that in because we had someone in the audience ask about what is the likelihood of EU military observers. I would say my personal one is figuring out a way to trace the funds that are accruing from oil revenues in the Libyan Foreign Bank's NOC reconciliation account, then to the CBL, and then to Libyan communities, seeing the flow of those funds to Libyan communities and seeing that each community gets their allocated bit, either by territory or population. That's an example of what is a win-win that I would contribute. Can I ask you, Deborah, what's an example of a win-win that you'd like to contribute to the process?
No, Jason, that actually is something that we did propose in, I think it was 2014. And in fact, the US government, we presented a paper to the head of the national oil company at the time, because that has been our position, that with greater transparency about both the exploration, the production, and the marketing of Libyan oil, you would invest Libyans more in fighting for the stick together, and also make it more equitable, if not equal. And in that regard, we raised, for example, in the United States, Alaska, our energy producing states, New Mexico, where I live, Louisiana, Alaska, receive actual certain benefits from having the costs of production in their areas. But in fact, I think that sort of transparency that you've discussed, where it comes in, how it goes to the bank, how it's distributed, who sees where it is, I think that would go a long way toward investing Libyans in their own national wealth.
Well, I obviously agree with that. Wolfgang, what would your win-win be? And maybe you could tell us a little bit more, because questioners have asked about the idea of EU military observers / peacekeepers.
Well, let me start with, I would say that there are three fruits hanging at the reachable level. These three fruits are the three-person presidential council, with one representative each from each of the three historic provinces. And most important, those three people must be legitimated by the HOR and by the Supreme State Council together. What Libya needs is some kind of government and presidential council which has also national legitimacy. And this could be achieved right now. The second fruit is also in mid-level is the oil revenues. You have discussed already about this, and I would like to stress again, this would take much of the heat out of the conflict. And the third one is this demilitarized zone. I think there are certain preconditions. The first one is that the Libyans, namely most likely this presidential council, needs to invite the Europeans. I don't think that the European Union is ready to enforce its way in. But I guess they are willing to send troops if they are invited to Libya. It is still a risky mission, because the threat would be not only from the two belligerent parties, but in particular from the jihadists hanging around, talking about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Maghreb remaining elements, and so on. So these are the three fruits, and I think the European Union could be ready to answer this question if there is a consensus that the Libyans want them. I'm sure the Egyptians would also agree, because this would secure their key security interests. I'm not so sure about Turkey, but this is a way of negotiation.
Thank you for that detailed answer. Jonathan, what would your low-hanging fruit be? And I'll toss also a question from Hassan Sassi, who writes, under a Biden-Harris administration, how different would the US policy towards Libya be? And in what ways would it differ from the Obama-Biden watch we've already seen?
Low-hanging fruit would be agreement in principle for sharing of revenue at the local level. Not with the government in the East, particularly, but at the local level, municipal level. And then you get Libyans representing the cities in discussion of how that would work. And part of that deal is you get all the oil turned on, and a commitment that that's the way it's going to flow. There's going to be direct payments to Libyan families, individuals, direct payments to the cities. And so the revenue is divided up in a stabilizing fashion. That is the most important thing. How would the Biden administration be different? Of course, we don't know, but we do know that people on the Biden team at the top, the core members of the team, have a lot of experience in Libya. They learned from Ambassador Jones. They dispatched afterward Special Envoy Weiner, and Ambassador Jones, Special Envoy Weiner were able to contribute to bringing about the Scarab process, which is a process of alignment. We're trying to create win-wins. Having been gone through the suffering of Benghazi and the NATO decision and experienced all of that in 2011 to 2020, that's a lot of years of experience now in thinking about Libya. And so they go in without naivete, with some humility, some experience, and I believe a willingness to commit real time and effort to try to get Libya right, which I believe to be the kind of approach that we've laid out today, which is creating disincentives for anyone trying to gain undue advantage and incentives for success. I give you one perfect example in another area: oil and gas rights. There's no way Turkey is going to get its Eastern Mediterranean problem solved through leveraging Libya. It's a throwaway. It's something that has to be negotiated away through some broader deal with Greece and some broader deal with Egypt. Last I knew, Greece was in the Eastern Mediterranean and Egypt was in the Eastern Mediterranean, not just Turkey. So they have to work out deals with that. What's this about Libya? That's not where Libya is. So the United States can help by being very pragmatic on these issues with each of these countries. They've all got other fish to fry with the United States, all got other issues as well as this issue. So you make this issue part of what's necessary to have a good relationship. And that's where I think you'll see policy in the Biden administration as opposed to transactional deals. You'll see continuity, and I think you'll see steadiness. And the steadiness, continuity, and policy-based efforts, I think, will go a long way towards helping create a stable framework for negotiated settlements. The East is going to have to get bailed out economically, in part, from all the unwise spending that's engaged. Libyans have to cut that deal. The United States can't cut that deal for them, but the United States can participate in making sure that those discussions happen, and that's something the East wants, and it can only get it fundamentally by a deal, as long as your oil delivery and revenue from oil continues to remain unified, which is essential for Libya to survive as a country, and therefore ought to be in everyone's interest. Thank you.
Well, it was very encouraging to hear that of the four of us, we have different viewpoints and different emphases, but everyone agrees that oil revenue sharing going essentially directly to the communities is a low-hanging fruit that's required for win-wins. Now to turn to some more audience questions. We've got a lot of questions about the role of Turkey. So I'm going to group them all into one, and then maybe we'll do ladies first. So the first one is, would Turkey object to an EU peacekeeping force instead of a UN peacekeeping force? Then how would the Turks feel about the different Morocco, Egypt, and Switzerland tracks? Then we have from Alan Riddis, Wolfgang mentioned Turkey is training Tripoli troops. Will the Turks use this to their military advantage? And would the Turks try to complete their trainings before any elections would happen in Libya? Sticking with Turkey again to Wolfgang, Christian Weissflog says, do you have details on the kind of Turkish training and additional weapons they are delivering? And I'll put in a plug for the fact that Wolfgang and I are writing a paper for the Middle East Institute about exactly the technological things that the Turks have introduced and how that changed the aerial supremacy that used to be for the LNA coalition and then gone over to the GNA coalition. So Christian, stay tuned for that paper to be published at the end of October. And then, is Greece trying to cut Turkey out and to have an Israel-Cyprus-Greece natural gas alliance? How does that fit in? That's from Bruce Rosen. And then Fadil in Sirte asks, is Turkey trying to extend through to Mali and have a security agreement in Niger? Very interesting question. So I think that's a lot for us to take. I'll pause there. And what in that whole plethora of questions about Turkey would you like to start with, Deborah?
Dear Lord, make it easy. First of all, I just do want to go back to what I said before. I think if you look again historically at Turkish interventions or Turkish activities, they never go into places on a whim. It's always because they consider that they have a legacy connection there, whether it was in northern Iraq or it's on the in Syria or in Libya or in Cyprus with the other side of Cyprus. So let me bat away that last question. I just don't see the Turks overextending themselves there in Niger or anywhere else when they've got all of this stuff cooking right now with Azerbaijan and in Syria and elsewhere. And they're also, let us not forget, they're broke right now. They do have real interests in Libya. Let me also remind people the Turks have had an experience training Libyans before, and it didn't go so well. I think that they, say what you will about Turkey, they are a nation state in the classic definition, and their strength as a state, as a military state, has been institutions and military organization. They are the masters of engineering and that. So they don't go into these things blindly. And by the way, I would tell you that I have analysts who have suggested to me that, in fact, the Turks showed their hand in their capabilities in Libya with the Panzer attack, that was actually a bait for them that was perhaps, according to some that I listened to, funded by the UAE using Russian equipment that could be lost in that kind of an exercise that gave them a window on what actual Turkish capabilities were. So I do think they're quite pragmatic in this. I do think that they will train Libyans now, perhaps in Libya, and they've brought in Syrians who had worked for them. I think that they were not the only ones, by the way, who brought in Syrian mercenaries. Do I think that they relish any kind of on-the-ground engagement with Turks in Libya? I don't think so. I think that they stepped in at a time when they saw basically a green light having been given to Haftar. As you said, Jason, you know, the GNA, the capital in Tripoli was at risk. They saw that as a UN, that was kind of a win-win for them in their mind, because that was a UN supported government. So they could therefore go in and say, all we're doing is supporting the UN process. And in the meantime, you know, poking a stick in the eye of some of their competitors in the region, largely the UAE. You know, Russia, not so much. They have that complicated relationship with Russia where they're in cahoots with them in some ways, and in other ways they're in competition with them. I mean, Brave New World here, but it was a way of reestablishing themselves as the regional power. So, you know, do I think that Turkey is prepared to go all in with some kind of military engagement in Libya? No, I don't. I think that was a holding that stopped it. You know, Wolfgang, I have to say, I have a different view than you have on Egyptian willingness to go to Sirte. You know that I've stated that before, that Sirte suddenly became a red line. I think that was a little bit of goading from someone else. The Egyptians, their hands are also tied with other things. So I think the Turks have mostly been, there's been a lot of posturing here. And a reminder, would they agree to having European troops go in? I doubt it. I can't see that they would think, because that removes their card in a way too. And the Turks would be perfectly happy to work out some arrangement with the Russians, and even a de facto, I'm sorry to say, but a partitioned Libya, or one that is much more federal in nature than what we see now, with not just the 3 divisions, with multiple divisions throughout the country around certain areas.
Okay, Wolfgang.
I just give a few quick bullets about all this as we are coming to an end of our session. Let me stress, Turkish stability is in the interest of its neighborhood, especially in the interest of Europe. It is important for the Europeans, for the others, to strengthen Turkish economy. The problem is only the way that how Erdogan conducts his foreign policy in an extremely aggressive way. You know that this is not only my opinion, this is not only the opinion of many Europeans. Just have a look on the exchange rate of the Turkish lira and about the Turkish bonds. EU, UN peacekeeping force. Actually, it doesn't matter. I think it's important to have such a demilitarized zone with military forces in there. It's more likely the EU will be able to deploy such forces within a short notice than the United Nations. The EU would need a mandate anyway. And as Deborah said, if the EU are there, that's game over for any kind of offensive to the east or to the west from any of the parties, and maybe not all the sides like this. Let me explain. It's important to prevent, and in the background there is a debate about this, to prevent a Russia-Turkey deal like in Idlib. To prevent a Russia-Turkish deal, a peace deal about a peace force or something like this, jointly between Turkey and Russia, because we know the outcome from Syria. The military tool, the training, the deployment of weapons and so on, gives Turkey additional options, as I've explained before. Egypt would intervene if the price is low. If the price is low, as it is right now. If the price is getting higher because of a combined armed forces on Operation Volcano, the Egyptians will probably think twice about it. With regard Niger and Mali, not really our area right now, but Turkey, yes, Turkey increases its influence in these areas. Turkey is cooperating with local political Islamists in these areas, and I see some more troubles out on the horizon, because this area, especially Niger with its uranium mines, is of vital French interest. And I see some dark clouds on the horizon about this.
That's a very interesting answer. And because we are kind of low on time, Jonathan, would you like to talk about Turkey, or shall I group together the Russia questions and ask you those?
Whichever you want. That's whatever.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Hakeem Nas. Has the prominent Russian military presence and the corresponding political role in the Libya arena been interpreted as a realization of the strategic partnership that was declared and signed back in June 2018 between Mohammed Ziad and Putin? That's something I've never heard about, so I'd love to have thoughts about that. Then we have from David Mack, Does Russia have a genuine strategic interest at stake in Libya, or is it trying to make problems for Western Europe and the US in Libya? And then we have another question. What is the Russians' role and approach to the parallel tracks and negotiations in Morocco, Egypt, and Switzerland, and the opportunity to reach an agreement?
Well, Russia has wanted to have a warm water port as long as there's been a Russia. So it's a strategic interest that I think has been opposed by Europeans and Turks most of the time, except for a very brief period at the start of World War I, for hundreds of years. So sure, would Russia love to have a permanent military base in Libya if it was a positive thing and didn't create blowback? Sure, why not? If you think about Libya as a geopolitical chessboard, when you make a chess move, you're not looking at which path early in the game is going to prove out to have you win. You're looking to create as much opportunity as possible. The Russians have created all kinds of opportunities for themselves by their engagement during the United States' period of disengagement. So I think that Russia will move opportunistically based on the space that's left of it. I don't think Russia is going to withdraw much from Libya unless Libyans push it out. Russia is not always the best partner for countries. Russia does find from time to time countries choose to push it out because it's not a great partner. So we'll have to see there what Libyans are going to decide. But I think Russia will do whatever it can. And certainly the Turkish hosting of multilateral diplomatic activities in an effort to determine the framework for political negotiations has been pretty consistent in 2020. It's been recurrent anyway, and it hasn't had a whole lot of success. I'm still wondering when Putin is going to punish Haftar and how for walking out on Putin's effort to have a big party, birthday cake and ribbons and bows and party favors, and blow up the cake and say a done deal. And Haftar just walked out on it, what I thought was a humiliation and embarrassment for Russia. But what Haftar can do, other Libyans can do. They can do it to any country. So you have to wind up, if you want to play in Libya, if you want to work Libya, on working for solutions that genuinely are stabilizing and genuinely create win-wins. And Russia has not been notorious for that over the years. It's not something that is a main feature of Russian diplomacy. You tend to see Russia engaged in a spoiler role more often than in a constructive role where it is building enduring partnerships and relationships on a multilateral basis. So fishing in troubled waters, sure. Warm water port, sure. What to do about it? Come up with solutions that do require win-wins. And if Russia chooses to participate in them as it did in Skora, great. Include Russia in the process, get there, great. If it then wants to be a spoiler, then you isolate it like you would any other spoiler. But give everybody a choice to be inside solutions or outside the solutions. But let's create those solutions. Thank you.
Yes, that was an excellent way of framing from a diplomat's craft of how to create those win-wins and how to contextualize working with Russia. I think that to close the session, it would be great to give everyone like 60 seconds kind of closing thoughts. And to prompt that, I thought one of the best questions came from Alexander Werman, who wrote, can Haftar be sidelined or isolated to such a degree that a political reconciliation agreement can be reached by the political stakeholders in Libya, i.e. the HOR and Saleh on the one hand, and then the GNA, Sarraj, Mishri on the other, as well as CBL and NOC? And would Haftar seek to play spoiler to this type of arrangement at all costs? So in your kind of final, maybe you could address both that and another questioner who said, so what's really come out of these UN Berlin talks? You know, the official statements have not revealed much. So what does it mean that there are these different tracks as I posed in my opening? Deborah, your closing thoughts?
Sure. In a nutshell, I think that Haftar is actually being sidelined through his own incompetence and the realization of others that he is not a tool capable of carrying out the job. Now, they may look for other ways, but I think that he can be sidelined. I would also say, and I've urged Siraj and others, to reach out in unorthodox ways to people like possibly Saif al-Islam or others in a reconciliation process that includes all Libyans. And because I do think that that's the only way you're going to bring the country back together is through some sort of interaction and engagement with people who are acceptable to the Libyans. And I believe that there are some for whom there are red lines. Haftar is one of them. Abdullah Sanusi may or may not be another one, but people like Saif, I think, there are compromises that can be found. Libyans are very good at compromise. I would just say to you that final point, Jason, that I think what Jonathan and I both saw in Sirte and in Berlin and in Geneva and elsewhere, that the value of these conversations, of these discussions, was actually, believe it or not, having Libyans get to know one another. We saw that happen so many times that when they were able to actually meet one another in a friendly environment, in a safe environment, and talk through what their anxieties, what their passive and what their resentments were. It didn't heal everything immediately, but it was an important step on the way to healing. And in that context too, just in terms of getting to know themselves and each other, I'd just like to give a boost to the latest publication that I think Mary Fitzgerald and Emma Dean wrote about the LIFG and the history of the LIFG, and talking to some of the people and what they see as their mistakes and what their vision is. But I think you can find, as Jonathan has alluded to, you can find a shared vision for Libya from Libyans, and it's important to give them a chance to work that out.
Ken, your closing thoughts?
Actually, I would say all the discussion is way too much Haftar-centric. This is not about Haftar's grievances. This is about the grievances of the East and of the grievances of other people. Haftar is not involved in all the turmoil right now in Tripoli. The way forward would be, as we've discussed already, the political process with the three-person presidential council and all the other things we've discussed. But one needs to be aware, Haftar still enjoys the loyalty of most of the fighters of the Libyan National Army. This means his signature will be required under any ceasefire agreement.
Jonathan, your closing thoughts?
Khalifa Haftar made clear to me that his vision for Libya was with him as a dictator, and he had no other vision and nothing else acceptable. So it's hard for me to imagine that he's going to sign anything unless he sees it as increasing the probability that he's going to have that outcome. So I don't look to that signature as a solution particularly. It may or may not happen. I rather look to decisions being made by the internationals that the time has come for another political settlement, which in turn provides an enabling mechanism for the Libyans to talk things through with economic benefits, security benefits, and political benefits, as mentioned, to all the regions. That's where I would imagine things will eventually go. I just don't think they're likely to go there this week or this month. But 2021 will provide new opportunities to get there.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for presenting many different views, some contrasts, as well as some unity on the importance of the idea of sharing oil revenues in a way that Libyans find equitable, and seizing the low-hanging fruits that might be possible in any economic process. I want to end on a programmatic note of saying that Wolfgang and I have this forthcoming paper about how Turkey turned the tide in the war for Tripoli, trying to understand the technological as well as tactical and strategical elements, and what that can say for other theaters like Syria or Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as how mid-21st century warfare differs because of the way in which drones and anti-aircraft and counter-anti-aircraft technologies are used. I hope you'll join us for that. The date should be being announced soon, and we hope that publication will come out by the end of October. It's been a real pleasure to host you here at the Middle East Institute, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you.